Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Heather, Kim, and Amy. In this second part, we're going to do a deep dive into their grandfather's history. We're going to learn all about him growing up in the German American community in Washington, D.C. We're going to learn about his early years with his primary and secondary education, as well as how he went from the Revenue Cutters, which was the forerunner of the Coast Guard Academy, to the Marine Corps, and then his exploits in World War I, Haiti, China, and then leading the U.S. 1st Marine Division in the Battle of the Pacific in the early years of World War II. This one is going to focus a lot with their grandfather and hearing about his story and his past. Then what I would suggest you do, if you haven't listened to part 1, go back, listen to part 1, and then that will catch you up on why they underwent this journey, what was going on with them. And you're going to also hear, too, about just how close they've come to their grandfather over this whole exercise and period of time. So pull up a chair, grab yourself a beverage, and enjoy our conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hey, Heather. Hey, Kim. Hey, Amy. Really appreciate you guys coming back for a part 2 about your grandfather. And this conversation, what we want to dive into is more of the relationship that you guys have found with your grandfather. We spent the first episode talking about some of the mechanics with the research and how you guys got started with investigating your grandfather. Here, what we want to do is get to know your grandfather a little bit more, and then also get to know how becoming more knowledgeable about him has affected the relationship with him, and then how's it affected the relationship with you guys. So as we start out, let's jump in. Tell us a little bit about William here.
Hey, Greg. Hey, great to be here.
Hey, Greg. So here we have my sister, Heather, who is in Virginia, Kimberly, who is in Manhattan Beach, California, and Amy, who I'm speaking, who is in Charlotte, North Carolina. Greg, thanks for doing this. This is so exciting. Like, you're talking about grandpas who are so important, and we don't know about them. In this case, we really didn't know about our grandfather other than because he died in 1940. He was born in 1889 and he died in 1945. And he was this kind of legend in our family, a Marine Corps Major General who had written the famous Rifleman's Creed that a lot of Marines know by heart, that's been featured in movies like Full Metal Jacket and all sorts of movies. Basically, we have known about him. Our father lost his dad, this Major General that we're talking about, when he was 5 years old, and then he lost his mother when he was 16. So we had all this information about these legends in our family that were part of this epic time in history that we never got to meet. But we had all these clues that were left behind, which has always kind of haunted us, feeling like we need to do something about these clues or learn more about them. And basically our grandfather was Marine Major General. His name was William Henry Rupertus, and he was author of the Rifleman's Creed and commanding officer of the 1st Marine Division, who is celebrating their 80th anniversary this week. And he was in some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. I think all the battles in the Pacific were pretty bloody, but he was in a lot of them and oversaw them. And he also had a destroyer, a naval destroyer named after him called the USS Rupertus. So that's kind of a simple background.
Now, how about any of the details as far as where he grew up, what schools, academies, some of his early years? What are some of the details around that, if you guys know?
Well, we've done a lot of research, and I definitely want my sisters to chime in. Our family are from Germany, and they immigrated to Washington, D.C., of all places. As we've talked about, there was a huge German American community in Washington
This is in the
They lived-
1850s that they came.
Yeah. The Concordia Church in Washington, D.C. was founded by the German people, and they still do 2 services a week in German, which I find amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Rupertus family, they were all members of that church. But the first ancestor of ours that came in was in the 1850s, and so that was our grandfather's grandfather.
Another legend in our family, because their family expanded, but Gottlieb, basically they were all restaurateurs, club owners,
Saloon keepers.
and saloon keepers, merchants.
Sure.
When World War I came in, Gottlieb changed his name to Hermann, thinking that would anglicize it a little more because they got a little scared, right?
Right.
Well, the German church and the Germans went all underground, obviously, because of World War I, and that was caused by Germany. And the church went underground, and it was really a tight German-American community. And he grew up surrounding by or being part of this German-American community that were retailers, entrepreneurs, and
Big values.
Excuse me?
Had lots of values. Hard work
Values.
and all that.
His mother was very involved, and his grandmother very involved in the German orphanages. Like
Okay.
you think about DC, you imagine German orphanages there, but it was very, very much in the Prospect Hill, Northwest area of Washington. There was a lot of German American community, and a lot of them are buried in this really old, neat cemetery in Washington, Prospect Hill Cemetery. So Kimberly, you've done a lot of research on this.
Well, this is a little bit of ancestry, but it'll give you kind of a feel for what kind of community and what kind of environment our grandfather grew up in. And so he was definitely surrounded by a lot of family, a lot of faith, a lot of community. And these people worked together, they prayed together, they partied together. It seems like the Rupertuses were all very close because we have records of where they lived, and they lived across the street from each other, and they moved then someplace else, and they seemed to kind of cluster together, and they were always involved in church and activities together. So I think that's a really important thing. I mean, our grandfather had a brother and a sister, so he was in a smaller family.
Sure.
But his father was from a family of 4 boys and 1 girl. And all of that family lived in the Washington, D.C. area. So at least the paternal side of his family was in the Washington, D.C. area. We know a little bit less about my great-grandmother's side of the family, but he was obviously surrounded and supported. And it seems to me that he really was industrious and academic, and he really wanted to have a different life.
Sure.
I think the life was good. They were middle class. They were property owners, and they were merchants. And not all of them, but his family was. And I think that they were in a relatively good situation for the times. But it seemed clear that he wanted to make something of himself. And so, Amy, you can take it from there with this.
Well, and I was going to ask, do you think that's what drove him to apply and go for the Naval Academy?
He went to Emerson Elementary. Well, Kimberly can explain this.
Okay, do you want me to take it?
But he was extreme. But he came. I can't say he came from a military family, but his dad did serve in the Civil War briefly.
And his grandfather.
But Gottlieb, who's famous in this family, even though he was so old, But Kimberly, why don't you explain, because the information about him being in maybe a lot of people share this who are from DC who may know this, but Kimberly, why don't you talk about his elementary school and high school and the National Guard?
He went to a little elementary school called Grant Elementary, and then he went on to McKinley Manual Training School, and it then turned into McKinley Manual Technical School, and then McKinley High School. But back in the day when our grandfather was there, it was the Manual Training School, and it was for technology of the time. That's where was a science-focused school and also a vocational school, if you will. And then he graduated from that school in about 1906. And he went on and studied at Emerson Institute, which was I'll say an academy prep school. At the time, that's how they build themselves to facilitate admission to the academies, the Naval Academy, West Point, the Coast Guard Academy, which
is it still
what?
Is it still around?
It is still around, but it's in a different location. And I reached out to them last year, I guess it was, to get some records. And, I think they're a different type of school now, and no one was really available to help me out. But they still exist, but in a lesser capacity. But anyway, so we think that was. Oh, I skipped something. So in the middle of that, he also, after high school, joined the DC militia or the DC National Guard. We don't know if it was the National Guard that encouraged him to work at the Naval Gun Factory, or it was his relationship with Emerson Institute that may have gotten him the job, or maybe he got the job on his own. But he also worked as a draftsman and mechanic at the Naval Gun Factory, which is in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So he started out he worked there for 3 years and became a second lieutenant. And then somehow we don't know how he got interested in the revenue cutter service, but that was the armed service for the sea that was part of the predecessor for the U.S. Coast Guard. So this is a service academy, a small service academy just for revenue cutter guards and officers. At age 21, he was accepted into the Revenue Cutter Service Academy into a class of 14 people.
Wow.
And this is there's so little history on this, but it's so cool. But it's the predecessors to the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Anyway, that's pretty cool to us. But he graduated second in his class in 1913. However, he did not go on to the Revenue Cutter Service because he took an exam when he graduated, and he had Bright's disease, which is a kidney disease, and he would die within 5 years.
Wow.
That's what we found out through a paper.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there you go.
That's something. You go in for a physical, and then it's like, oh, by the way, you'll be dead in 5 years, so we're not going to.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to interject something there. So one of the things that we've heard over time is that he failed his physical exam. He was unfit for service, and he failed his physical exam. So it was interesting. It was like a eureka moment when we found these little articles about what actually happened. And he wasn't obviously unfit for service because shortly thereafter he got cleared. It was a temporary physical ailment. He got cured of Bright's disease or whatever, accepted a commission with the Marine Corps.
When he was 24, by 26, he had graduated first in his class as second lieutenant. And then he was swooped up to be on the Marine Corps rifle team.
What was so cool about the Cutters Academy Revenue Cutters Academy is what we found is we have scrapbooks from them. And so this was 1920 something. He took photographs and got them printed of them traveling all around the world. And
Wow.
they're in Spain, Gibraltar, all over, and they see snake charmers. And I couldn't believe how much they traveled. So he had a great experience at the Revenue Cutter School, but obviously was given this diagnosis that he would die. So what did he do with that? He joined the Marine Corps.
Sure. Because that's what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
there's a little bit of me that wonders, maybe the Marine Corps was like the bigger, better deal at the time. Not really sure how that works, but sure worked out for him.
Right.
So, and I like the fact that very early on at the McKinley Technical High School, he learned the motto, which is still today the same, is no excuses, just solutions.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of who he was.
Yeah, that's true.
I think the three of us too.
Well, I think he was definitely a driven person. I mean, if you get a diagnosis of you're going to die in 5 years,
Right.
You've got a girlfriend you're hoping to marry. You're this life ahead of you. He was 23 or 24, gone by 27.
Yeah.
And he chose to say, no way, I'm going to move on. And he applied for an exam examination with the Marine Corps, because back then as officers, I'm not sure you need to do that now, but it's a very serious examination. And he got in the Marine Corps, and he got married, and then he was sent to officers training school. And then World War I was going on. So he was shipped off to the USS Florida.
Commanded the Marine detachment on the USS Florida,
which was going to join the British fleet. We were going to try to show support for the British, and he was on that as commander of the Marine detachment. And then you all sisters are welcome to chime in as I'm reading this. During this time, he also had his first son, William Henry, who was born in 1917. But by 1919, he was ordered to Haiti. And when we were reading his service record, we're like, why were the Marines in Haiti? And I've heard different things. And the biggest thing that resonated with me, and you all can chime in, but the Germans were prowling all around, the Caribbean, and they were in Haiti. And the Marines were sent down for a number of reasons. But to quell the rest, because Haiti had so many presidents who had not survived. So it was
been assassinated, the disappearing presidency, one after the other, until the Marines showed up.
So the Marines came in, and they did some good, and they set up infrastructure, and they helped to build the police force, and also the Haitian rifle team that went on to the Olympics.
Oh yeah, you skipped over that. Can we just back up a second? So before he actually went into the, one thing at the Cutter Academy, they had a rifle team too. So they did a riflery in the Cutter Academy. But then when he got to the Marine Corps, Heather mentioned it earlier, but he was put on the rifle team, and he became expert marksman and won all sorts of competitions. And then you see throughout the rest of his career, he becomes an inspector of target practice. He becomes an instructor. He becomes someone that is always involved in making sure that riflery is a priority for the Marines, and that their program is in order. And so I think that's pretty interesting that it started that early.
Yeah, the minute he joined the Marine Corps, after he graduated officer training school, he was whipped out for the rifle team. So, but the big thing that really affected me, and I think it has affected all of us, well, I speak for all of us, but, he married Marguerite, who was from Washington, who he was best friends with her brother. I guess in Washington, they went to the Revenue Cutter School together. He married this girl. They had 2 children, and they went to Peking, China. The Marines, or Bill's first, our grandfather's first, they called it Far East duty back then, where the Marines were there to protect the American sector of the international settlement in Peking, China, which is now, of course, Beijing. And they got there, and it was very peaceful at the time in Peking. 20 years earlier, it wasn't peaceful, but this was a quasi-peace, and the Marines were there. And because it was so peaceful, they did their guard duty around the sector, and Bill, our grandfather, helped manage that as one of the commanding officers. But they also had a lot of time for social and athletics and
polo.
Yeah.
Right,
So
right.
General Holcomb, who was, or not general, he became General. Colonel Holcomb, who was there at the time, really was into polo. And he really encouraged all the senior officers to get their athletics through polo, which is pretty aggressive. And so our grandfather took that up. There was Peking at the time. I mean, there were all sorts of people there from all around the world that they got to meet. But sadly, they arrived, I guess, spring, I think, y'all.
1929.
And by
It was late June 1929, because it was around December and January when Marguerite and the 2 kids who were 14 and 4, within 2 months of each other, caught scarlet fever that was rampant through China, and they passed away. That was a big deal.
They arrived in June of 1929, and by December 1929, little Ann Rodney, their daughter, who was only 4 years old, got scarlet fever. the day before Christmas. And then it was sweeping through China, and it swept through Peking and right up into their house. And then by February, his wife, Marguerite, who's 38, got scarlet fever, and their son, who's 14, William Jr., got scarlet fever, and they all died, all gone.
So he was quarantined, and then the bodies were sent back for burial at Arlington Cemetery. And so when you go to Arlington Cemetery, where his big headstone is, on the other side of it, my dad and my mom are buried. And then off the side, you see like mother, I don't remember if it says daughter or son, or does it say Rodney and?
Yeah.
No, little teeny graves. You can barely see it.
Yeah, they're tiny.
But they're tiny little graves, and it's William Jr. And it's really sad. And so in the papers, so Bill couldn't come back, just like now with COVID, he couldn't come back.
And that had to just destroy him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I would guess so.
All of us going through the research of this it took me a really hard time. And I think my sisters too, about getting past this. I mean, how do you get past losing your entire family? I mean, your entire, your wife and children.
Oh, and you're shipping them home to your father-in-law. I mean,
not even being able to be with them or hug them, or it's like right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
COVID. And so we really felt that. It was really hard. And I kept like looking online to try to find more information about them, but there was no more information. I mean, Kimberly found more information about Marguerite and her family, our grandfather's first wife, but it was like so tragic. And somehow he prevailed. And his mother sent a telegram to him, said, Bill, this is his mother, Augustina, who's a really strong German lady, said, Bill, this is too strong. This is too much. You need to come home and, get over it. I don't know, repair, heal, whatever you do. And he texted, he telegrammed back that he was okay and he was going to stay there. I mean, he had no choice really to come home, but he stayed.
He could manage better. He could manage better there. Like, I think he could get over better situation, better being there and immersing himself in his work.
Yeah. So at Arlington, there was 3 people who were buried at one time and at the grave. And then he's back there. He was in the hospital for a while being quarantined. And then he got better about March. And so anyway, we should move on. But that was pretty tragic.
Well,
yeah.
After that, he eventually did get back and was doing, I don't know, what we term now a Pentagon rotation, and was doing, desk work, and was probably an adjutant to another general. A little bit of probably recouping and getting his mind right, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Now, where was he as the First or the Second World War was breaking out? Was he still at the Pentagon when all that happened, or had he started back to the Pacific Command before the war broke out?
I have to interject you. I don't understand what you mean by Pentagon rotation, because he was not affiliated with the Pentagon at all.
No, it's just you do desk work around different places.
Well, he was attached to headquarters Marine Corps, which was at
Oh, that's right, man. Thank you. My head. Pentagon didn't even exist at that time. Yeah. So that's
the cool thing is when he came back to the U.S., he met our grandmother Sleepy's dad, Joe Hill, who kind of took him under his wing. And then at a embassy Christmas party, that's where he was introduced to her for the first time, and he just hit it off because he loved her sense of humor, and she was young and vibrant and everything the 45-year-old man needed to get back into life, basically.
And I guess that was about 3 years later. That was about 3 years after the family passed.
But Greg, I think one thing that is important. So yes, he was. He came back. He met our grandmothers and his second wife's uncle. Eventually, they married and they had this life together. And the biggest thing I think is Joe. He went back to China with Sleepy after losing his whole family in China before.
Wow.
And he was brave enough to bring Sleepy back. And they went to Shanghai this time. I think Shanghai is still called Shanghai.
Wasn't that like the late 30s?
It was 1937.
Yeah, building up to World War II.
Okay.
And this is the fascinating time in history because the Marines were there protecting the American sector of the Shanghai, the international settlement.
Right.
And that is when it was calm at first when they got there. Well, quite not so calm, but the Japanese were beginning their descent into China, or they had since earlier. But they were there when the Japanese bombed Shanghai, which was a brutal bombing. We can go all into that, but they witnessed. So Bill, Sleepy, and our grandfather, and all the Marines, and everybody that was there witnessed the Japanese takeover of Shanghai, and it was pretty powerful. And then there was the rape of Nanking and everything that happened. So they were there during that time. They came back to the United States in 1938. And then by 1942 or 1941, he was in San Diego overseeing the Marine barracks there. And December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, et cetera, et cetera. Everything changed. And
Right,
he became commanding officer there. Then next thing you know, by March 1942, he's assistant division commander of the 1st Marine Division.
But just prior to that is when he rode the Rifle Creed, which was shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
So when he was at the base in San Diego, there were unbelievable amount of recruits. You can imagine, remember after 9/11, how many people joined the military. This was huge. They were trying to process all these young men who wanted to go fight. There were a lot of them. So anyway, they joined the Marine Corps, and I'm sure they joined the Army and every other branch. But he was tasked to oversee all these recruits. He felt like, and as far as the Rifle Creed, he knew the Japanese, he knew where they were going, or the Marines would be going. And he, according to that's been written, is he really felt like the Marines were going to go on these islands with their rifles, maybe a grenade, maybe a machete,
Yeah.
little else, maybe a little water, but they had their rifle and they really needed to slow down, figure out how to use their rifle, understand and appreciate it. So they knew, so when they went to the Pacific, they could be prepared for what they were going to face. That's how he didn't want the Rifle Creed to be like preachy. He just wanted to let them kind of sense that this is kind of an important thing. These young guys who want to go fight, slow down, figure out how to use your rifle, because at the end of the day, it's going to be your rifle, your machete, or a grenade, or maybe a knife.
Yeah.
But
He'd seen firsthand what the Japanese had done, and he knew of their tactics, and he, wanted to make sure that they knew inside and out, backwards and forwards, their equipment,
enemy
rifle, and they were going to be able to use it in that kind of dire circumstance.
And he was able to see what they were doing and realize that they weren't going to be a pushover, because there's a big misconception in the West that these Japanese were, we can roll over them. They're nothing like us. They don't have the same technology. They don't have the same fighting spirit and all this stuff, which proved to be absolutely wrong. But it took a while for that to come into play in those battles, early battles in Guadalcanal and defending those southern islands around Australia, where they were fighting within 30 yards of each other and they could barely see each other. And you're absolutely right. It was, and I just listened to Dan Carlin's podcast about Japan and World War II. So he went into much more detail about how gruesome it was and how up close and personal that fighting was, much more than in Europe. And so having, your grandfather's foresight about this rifle is my safety and it's my identity, and this is the thing that's going to keep me alive, probably had a huge impact on saving a lot of Marines and getting them in the right mindset about the kind of enemy that they were going to face. So that was...
Well, another chapter that was really hard for me to get through was Shanghai. to back up is the brutality. I mean, war is brutal, but what the Japanese, and again, the Marines, we were not engaged in war with Japan at the time. We were merely protecting the international settlement, and the stress was very high. If the Marines had engaged, we would have engaged with the Japanese. We would have started World War II in 1937.
Imagine they're just sitting there helpless because they're not allowed to do anything while all the Japanese are provoking them and killing people in front of them. And
they were witnessing daily executions at 5, rape of women and children. So our grandfather knew what the Marines were going to face in the Pacific, or what they could face. I think a lot of the Marines that were selected to go to the Pacific had all been, many of them had been in China and seen the Japanese experience.
In 42, he's now the assistant division commander. Is that right?
Yes.
And then at some point they get transferred. Did they go to Australia first, or how did the unit move out?
Well, so it was really
Island
studying this. So the vision was so huge, and because 2 wars were going on, in a sense, we had the Pacific War and the European War, and then we had the Germans prowling on the East Coast and the Japanese on the West Coast. So the shipping and transports, it was really hard to figure out how to transport a huge division of Marines, warriors, to the Pacific. So they had to split up. And so one division, a portion of the division left New River, North Carolina, and went to Norfolk and shipped out. And then our grandfather, the rear echelon, took the whole remaining part of the division on trains all across the country to San Francisco. And they left from there because the ships were available and it all worked out. So Vandergriff, who was the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division at the time, took the 1st Division out, and they went through around Florida, and they went through the Panama Canal out to the Pacific. And then our grandfather followed about a month later and they all arrived by June and July 1942 in New Zealand. Mm-hmm.
No, and that makes sense, because at that time the Japanese were pushing south, and New Zealand, New Guinea, that whole area was under a lot of threat. So definitely anybody that they could get in there was helpful. Now, how did things progress with him being gone? Did he ever have rotations back home to see your grandmother? Did your grandmother move to the West Coast to be even just a little bit closer? She stayed in D.C. with her sisters, basically. They had a house they rented on Foxhall Road, one of these old Tudor townhouse things. Basically, Bill, a lot of his people didn't know where he was going because it had to be secret, but he was going out doing speeches to the machinists who make all the, bolts and everything for the ships, and he had to parade through in front of Congress and all this kind of stuff. So when he wasn't at war, he was doing the rotation to keep everybody happy.
Yeah, he did have some PR duties, not in 1942, not 1942, 40.
Radio silent.
Yeah.
So Sleepy, so Sleepy had 2 sisters, Dixie and, oh my gosh.
Joe.
Bean. Yes. Dixie and Joe. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, all Dixie and Joe's husbands were Navy, and everybody, Dixie, Joe, and Sleepy's husbands were all in the Pacific. So the ladies stayed in Washington. The sisters stayed in Washington, and Dixie lived she had lived out in Maryland, and Joe and our grandmother Sleepy lived in Washington, and they were real close to their grandparents, their parents. So they would go visit all the time, while all the husbands were over in the Pacific.
Plus, they both had young children. So by this time, my father was born. And so, my father and his cousin Beverly would play together. They shared a home. And so they could have a nice environment for the kids, too.
But it was radio silence so they went to New Zealand, and then they left. They were supposed to be able to train for 6 months. The Joint Chiefs said, oh, no, you need to invade Guadalcanal in August versus January. So it was radio silence, and they really didn't communicate. A few people I know communicated, but it was pretty much radio silence to back home. And I don't know, we found a document that Roosevelt cut off communication because he did not want anything going back and forth.
Roosevelt
But, he
Knox
didn't. There
put the clamps on the press.
Well, and the other thing too is, remember all those movies where you had the posters, loose lips, sink ships.
Mm-hmm.
They were all told, I mean, everybody's mail was being censored. Mm-hmm. So whatever you wrote home, if you happened to mention the wrong thing, there was a marker that went through it.
Right.
You know, so there was all of that, because I know we were reading the Japanese communications, or had figured out how to read them. So there's got to be the reverse of like, well, if we can read theirs, maybe they can read ours. So yeah, clamping down and not letting people know where, especially senior officers are, because they track units based on the senior officers, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So again, the Marines split when they went to Guadalcanal. So there was Guadalcanal, the Florida Islands, and Tulagi, and the Marines again had to split transports because they had a lot to do. Not only invade Guadalcanal, but these Florida Islands of Tulagi. And so grandfather took the echelon to Tulagi, and that's where they first discovered the Japanese. And they had almost immediate fire with the Japanese on Tulagi, whereas Guadalcanal, the Japanese had raced out to the west when they found out, but they discovered they were being bombed.
So they weren't on the beach when the Marines came. Yeah, so that was August 7th, and then it was August 2, then through the end of the year, and it wasn't until, was it January when they changed command?
Well, in December 9th, the Army of 1942, the Army took over officially for the Marines. So generally the Marines were the attack force, and the Army would come in and mop up. And basically the Marines were after Guadalcanal and Tulagi, and the first entree into the boots on the ground in the Pacific, 75% of the division had malaria, and they had lost 20 pounds. They were gone. They were on 1 to 2 meals a day. And they went to Australia. They were in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia for 8 months. So at first the doctors thought, well, maybe they could be here for, a little less time, maybe 3 to 6 months. They were there for 8 months for rest, rehabilitation, and retraining.
Right. Now, how did things evolve with your grandfather taking the command of the 1st Division? And then how did things progress for him up and through the end of the war? Had he gone through all the island hopping and ended up in the Philippines, or where exactly did his action take him during those last few years of the war?
Well, first question was about being division commander. And I think he was aware, because of correspondence that we've seen, that it was coming. And as a matter of fact, it was supposed to be actually earlier than it was, but for certain reasons, Van de Grift had to stay in his post, even though he was supposed to go back to headquarters and become commandant. So he was aware of that this changeover would happen. And
during Melbourne, so they'd come back from Guadalcanal, they were fatigued, they were in the hospitals, and the Marines set up on the Melbourne cricket ground, in and around the Melbourne cricket ground. And about that time, General Van de Grift, who's the head of the 1st Marine Division, went to Washington. The then Commandant, General Holcomb, really wanted to retire. And he called Van de Grift home and told him all this. Van de Grift got the Medal of Honor for Guadalcanal. And during this time, our grandfather was in charge of the division back in Melbourne. And by July, he was division commander. So this is July 1943. And Van der Grift was on his way to being commandant.
But they knew on Guadalcanal that he was going to be division commander. They knew before, well before that.
Yeah. Then Van der Grift went on, and then by September, Eleanor Roosevelt came to Melbourne, and our grandfather escorted her around. She loved the Marines because her son was a Marine.
Okay.
But by late September, they were off again. They had rebuilt, and they were off again, preparing for their next operation, which was the Battle of Cape Gloucester. So he was pretty prepared. I mean, he'd been in the military for a long time. I think he was prepared had no qualms about the next battle.
And that was Cape Gloucester, New Britain, and now that was under MacArthur.
Okay.
So it was under the Army.
So he kind of rolled up under MacArthur. I think MacArthur was theater commander. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that rolled up under MacArthur, which
that battle. Yep.
Well, then where did he end up at the end of the war? Was he in the Philippines getting ready to stage? And I know I'm skipping over a bunch of history, but
so after Cape Gloucester, which was a great battle, everything went pretty well. It was boots on the ground. It wasn't so great.
Yeah, you just saying a great battle. I don't know.
It was. But as far as an allied collaborative battle, It was good. So the Marines had, it was hard. And the Marines went to an island. They thought they were going to go back to Australia, and they went to Pavuvu, which turned out to be an old coconut plantation that was just awful. And it looked great, South Pacific, beautiful.
Sure.
And as you pull up to the island and go in the island, it wasn't so great.
I guess
they thought they were going to have rest and relief and party and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, General Geiger had done a flyover and figured, it looks good, but he didn't really get the deep intel on it. So they sent the Marines there.
First, it was really bad. But our grandfathers, so this was May, and Vandergrift had wanted our grandfather to come back to Washington to give an assessment of the troops and recruit and get the veterans home and all the stuff. But MacArthur wouldn't release him or the 1st Marine Division. So he had to wait until May, once the division was in R&R, to go back to Washington. So this was the only time he went back. And he went back briefly and did some press tours and recruited and yada, yada. Anyway, he came back. This is during Pavuvu. The USO came, Bob Hope came. And there's some famous pictures and performances then that actually play at the World War II Museum. It's pretty cool. And they were planning for this next battle that had been on the agenda for years of Peleliu. They felt like they had created, the Marines worked on their plans and builded. O.P. Smith, who was his ADC at the time, and worked on the plans. They really felt that it was going to be, an effective plan because they were going to bomb the heck out of it, the island. They knew there were Japanese there on this island, Peleliu, but they were going to bomb the heck out of it and decimate as many enemy as they could. Well, the enemy were hidden in caves and tunnels and unbelievable connection engineering facilities that they created. They were hidden. So most of the bombing did not make an impact. I mean, it took away the trees. This became like a hellhole.
I think this became the model that happened with the other island advances. Going into Guam and everything else, is they figured out they dug into the volcanic rock and they dug in. And so all that naval bombardment, aerial bombardment, everything just blew away the trees. But there were still, 10,000 Japanese left, or, however many.
Now, when you tell, as the emperor, you tell your Japanese soldiers, we're not going to pick you up. This is it. They're going to fight crazy.
Well, there was no opportunity to not win.
Right.
And the same for the Marines. So I think there right before that was Tarawa. I always say this wrong.
Tarawa.
Which was really bad. And we found a letter from General Vandergrift to a senator who had written, why was this so bad? Why did so many Marines die and military die? And General Vandergrift had to explain what happens in war, and that the Japanese were hidden, and that this happened and it was really bad, but you can't imagine until you're here. So I found the Japanese plan for Peleliu and then compared it to the American plan, and vastly different. They had planned to dig deep, and I think the motto was delay and bleed, shoot some Marines, a lot of Marines on the beach, but pull them in closer. And so it was a pretty tough battle, and it was really hard. And I think, well, you all can chime in, but it really push my grandfather or our grandfather to press on and press on and press on. And he got a lot of shit for that. But at the end of the day, what are you going to do with these? There was no retreat possible. Where are you going to go?
So in your research with your grandfather, did you find diary entries about how this did affect him? Because, there's not a lot that comes out necessarily from the commander's diaries. We typically, you hear about the captain or the corporal or somebody else that went through it, but
something that was hilarious about this was when we were going through all the archives, we found one file, and I don't remember who the guy was, but you could tell by reading it that he was writing everything to maybe write a book someday or something. Remember
he was
that?
writing his history. He was writing his history. Yeah, he wasn't really writing a diary. He was writing his version of how he wanted to be remembered. So, but I guess that's happened. That happens. History is kind of made sometimes by those that write about it and those that tell about it.
Well, we Heather about it earlier that we had discovered a letter from our grandfather on the sea the night before Peleliu, the Battle of Peleliu, and what he wrote about to our grandmother, that he, it was, calm. He was praying. He wasn't sure it was going to be as simple as they thought it would be. It might be a little tougher. And he just prayed. He said, we can do all we can. Just pray for us. And then we have letters between he and Vandergrift, the commandant, during Peleliu. And then we have a letter from him right off of after the battle, where it's a total of all his letters to the Pacific. This letter is totally different. It is exhausted. This was a hellhole. We're going to work on citations and everything. And it was very matter of fact. There was no joking. There was no fun. It was very matter of fact. This was a hellhole. We now think Pavuvu is a paradise. This has been tough.
Yeah. So, it was those types of things, the correspondence is really enlightening. And so it definitely, we didn't paraphrase it right, but there was a lot in that letter, that particular letter that was important. It gave you an idea of what he was thinking at the time and then later, how important it was to press on, and that ultimately they did prevail. Ultimately they did, take the airstrip, and ultimately they did win, but at great cost of life.
Right.
Now, looking back on it, people say, oh, you didn't even need to go to Peleliu. That's not relevant. Yeah. That's not relevant in kind of the historical process. You asked what the method was of putting this together. We have to look at everything, all the information that he had at the time. Our idea wasn't to go back and second guess the judgments that were made based on criteria from today. Whether they needed to go there or not, it doesn't matter. They were there and they had a job to do, and they did it. And he had the tools and he had the team to get it done. And things happen as things happen in war that made that not as seamless as they would have liked. And, fault could be distributed all over the place for that. But unfortunately, because he's no longer around, the little sound bites get exploited. And so
cut and pasted.
Yeah. And exploited. I think that he's really been exploited in this. There may have been a comment was made that, he thought it would be quick and basically quick and dirty, but that's not what he said. But, it's going to be tough like Tarawa, or however you pronounce it, Tarawa. But it's, but we'll prevail, and it'll be over in 3 days, maybe 4. Well, everyone likes to say if you see something about Rupertus, it typically says he predicted that it would be over in 3 or 4 days. Well,
the Marines and the Army had the amphibious thing down. They had the airplane thing down. They had up until a year waiting for this to happen. They had gotten their whole act together. They knew how to go in and blow things. They knew it.
Well, and the intelligence that they had,
what they were heading into there.
Yeah, the intelligence they had and the bombing that was done told a different story.
Mhm.
So,
But told Sleepy, our grandmother, in this letter he said a few words after the movie on Pavuvu, and he just didn't want the Marines to worry too much. And in retrospect, do you tell them to worry a lot? I don't know.
yeah, what are you going to tell them? Hey, this is going to be a bitch.
Right.
And
Navy has bombed the hell
let's
out
not go. Or, I don't know.
Yeah, you have to go. That's the whole point. And that's, I think, something that gets lost is it's easy for us 50, 60, 70 years after the fact to go, oh, well, here's the number of Japanese and here's how this was, and they didn't have that information. And the thing, you guys have brought it up, you have to go.
No hesitation.
You don't have a choice.
You can't hesitate.
There's no super easy way and super hard way, and everybody chose the super hard way. It was, there's one way we're going in.
And all these guys that were there had been at war for a long time, even the guys on the ground, boots on the ground. So they kind of knew what they were doing. They were hardened, but.
And that overall had to just take a health toll on your grandfather as well. I mean, that amount of stress and responsibility, and
I would think so.
I think all those
he
guys
came back, and then of course he smoked and drank and all the types of food they used to eat. But
I don't think but he did smoke.
He was he had a heart attack. That was it.
Well, before that, he didn't. So they left Peleliu around October 20th, and he really didn't get back to Washington. So they went back to Pavuvu. They had to work on after action reports. I think it's special action, a record of events, after action reports, and figure out what the citations were and all that. And he didn't really get back to Washington until mid-November. And then he wrote that I hope Vandergrift doesn't make me go on a bunch of PR tours. Well, sure enough, he went on a bunch of PR tours. And we have a really cool recording that Kimberly found of him talking. We have the written one that was printed out, but we don't have the actual recording. But Kimberly found it so we could hear our grandfather's voice talking about the war in the Pacific and his view on the war in general. And it was only getting harder as we got closer to the homeland. And so he was back in Washington. He was commandant of the Marine Corps schools at Quantico, and they were having a good life. And he got this Distinguished Service Medal, and there was a big ceremony for that. He went on a couple other tours, PR tours, and then they went up to Washington from Quantico to the Navy Yard at the Marine Corps Barracks, and they were there for a party of old 1st Marine Division friends. He felt a little uncomfortable, so he went outside probably to get some
on the outside steps.
Hopefully he didn't go out to have another cigarette, but he went out, sat down, and then he went back in supposedly, and then he went back out again because he said he didn't feel well, and he had a heart attack.
Massive heart attack, yeah.
And
in my grandmother's arms.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, our dad was 5, and he was there with some friends at the Marine Corps Barracks, and
they wouldn't let him go to the funeral.
Wow.
Yeah. Funeral was the next day, which I still can't figure out, so he died on the 25th, March 25th. The funeral was on the 26th at Arlington.
I thought it was 3 days later, but I don't know. I will say, I do want to go back just to Peleliu for a second, and some things that have been written, snarky comments. Oh, he was relieved. He wasn't. The assault phase of Peleliu was declared over. He turned over the command, as was expected that he was to turn over the command. And he had been in the Pacific, except for that one trip in May. Was it over 2 years?
Yeah.
Right.
So it was time for the Marines that had served all that time to go back, and he was a part of that group. So just to clarify that little tidbit.
Sure.
He wasn't relieved because of any defect of duty
or anything.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So.
Well, Well, and it wasn't, to just tag on to that point, it wasn't uncommon for your mid and senior level commanders to do those rotations out, because coming back home, they brought back all those frontline experiences that were helping with procurement orders, that were helping evaluate gear, that were helping with training efforts, and even strategic planning that was going on in different headquarters, right?
Yeah, and he turned the operation over to Pedro de Valle, who he had served with for many years, even going way back to Haiti. When he turned the command over, Pedro de Valle promised him that the flag that was raised over Peleliu would be raised.
And Cape Gloucester.
Oh, and Cape Gloucester would be raised in the next battle. And so it was raised over Surrey Castle. And that's kind of a cool little tidbit as well. But it was actually, that happened after our grandfather had passed. So it was particularly significant. And the Marine that raised the flag over Surrey Castle, Colonel Ross, we've discovered also served with him way back in China, and served with him. Did he serve with him in Guadalcanal too, Amy?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yes, he served with him elsewhere. And so I think it was a special tribute to him as well, that he was the one to raise the flag in honor of our grandfather.
So one of the questions that I wanted to ask you guys is, when was there a turning point for you guys personally when your grandfather went from becoming kind of a story or something that you had heard about into becoming a flesh and blood person? I mean, you guys are very passionate about your grandfather, and still defending his record. Aggressively defending it, which I love. So don't get me wrong, but there's got to be a turning point when you guys were doing this research and when you guys felt like you were wanting to investigate his life, where he became flesh and blood to you guys.
For me, it was definitely Peking. When I started researching all this and trying to organize and synthesize all the data we had, I got to Peking, and I'm like, again, how do you lose your whole family and recover? Not that I couldn't, just saying.
Right.
But I thought, in seeing these beautiful children and this wife, and then all of a sudden they're gone, and not being able to find anything about them on Google or anywhere. I was like, literally, I think one night at 2:00 in the morning, I kept just looking and looking and looking. And that point, I realized I felt kind of, I can't imagine what he would have felt, but the sadness and how do you move on? How do you pick up your bootstraps and get the guts to go out the door and say, I've lost my whole family, I'm going to move on. And that to me was like really physical. And then I thought about him playing polo and like really getting into slamming, the mallet and being, just getting that aggression out. So that's where I personally felt the connection. And that took me a while to get beyond that. Really, Heather?
Heather, Kim?
Gosh, I don't know. Aunt Jo was kind of like, she's a great aunt, but she was kind of like our grandmother. She kind of took care of my dad after his mom died, and she kept the stories alive for us. But as dawdling with genealogy for the family, I came to know more about him from when we went to Prospect Hill and saw all of his family there. When we drove and we saw the school that he went to, and we saw the house that they lived in at one time. So it kind of put him in an area that helped flesh out his younger story for me. But Aunt Jo was big with clippings and things that you would find talking about him all the time. So I don't know. I think early knowledge was there, but the more intense knowledge came when we cracked open that plastic bin I have of all the documents and other things. And we started going through those and laying them out and realizing, wow, this is, we didn't know a lot. No, we see like the parties, pictures, and, you know, people in dresses of certain ages and things like that. But yeah, I would think it's more when we start fleshing out, because I think we all felt bad about the loss of his original family. I mean, a lot of the fancy linen napkins and things like that, and the silver had her initials on it. And how weird is it that we didn't know anything about his first wife, her family? I mean, we eventually found it, but it's, yeah.
So I think for me, you know, I've always been fascinated by the story. I love history and I love genealogy, and I just was really intrigued by everything. And of course, Aunt Jo definitely encouraged us to, as she say, we would know the family through her. Mm-hmm. And, but two things happened really. As I got a little older, and really after my father died, my mother was, I think she was watching some TV show or something. She saw something online.
Winds of War.
Some TV show online. And she was so frustrated because she felt that our grandfather, her father-in-law, our grandfather, was being maligned. And those little sound bites that we discussed earlier were coming up in the other things that she knew and that my father knew because of the records that they had reviewed and that we had. It wasn't the same story. So there was this sort of feeling of unjust determination of his character and so on. And so she was kind of on the warpath to try to figure out why this person who made this movie and how did they come up with this. So she kind of followed that trail and wrote some letters, and she got some feedback from this person, Joe Alexander, who had done the research for the book. And he said, you know, I understand it sounds like you have a lot of information, and I encourage you to write this story. We went off of the information that we had and whatever, and we, you know that it's not everything. But just that feeling of being wrongly accused or things being unfair, like, you know, I can say something about my sister, but if you say something about my sister, you better watch out. Right. So I think it just kind of got us a little bit more emotional, me a little bit more emotional about really wanting to know who he was, whatever, good or bad or indifferent. I wanted to know more. And my husband and I were taking a trip to Japan. I think it was maybe in 2010 in the spring. And I had seen the pictures that were in the family albums of Shanghai, and I knew my grandparents had spent some time there. So we made plans to go there. And so that's when it became personal for me, because I started doing research about their time in Shanghai. And I really, we walked in their footsteps. Mm-hmm. We went to the same places. We went to the places that they lived. We went to the places that they, not all of them, but just what I knew at the time. And interestingly enough, my husband happens to be Japanese. And so it was an interesting journey for both of us. I mean, he's a third generation Japanese American, but it was an interesting journey for us. And so that's when it became personal, and in particular, and those feelings of understanding who he was, it came more alive, especially when we're sitting on the same stairs that this really great picture is taken of my grandfather, my grandmother, and their Marine Corps friends after a black tie affair. My husband and I went to that same spot in what was called the French Club, and we sat on those stairs and took a photograph, and it was just a crazy moment, because Here I am, so many years later, and married to a Japanese man who's fantastic, and sitting in the spot that my grandfather and grandmother sat in 1937.
Wow.
So it's just, that's when it became personal.
That's cool. how did doing all this research affect your relationship? Do you guys think it brought you closer together? Because it seems like you guys were already pretty close. So I don't know if it had an effect one way or another with you guys, but kind of curious about that.
I think it brought us closer. Used to be we'd see each other up in the lake in the Adirondacks, or maybe for a holiday like Thanksgiving or something. But now we FaceTime once a week, which is nice. Try to. Yeah, it's pretty close to that. And yeah, I think it's brought us closer. It's enabled us to learn a little more about each other and how we work and how we think too.
Yeah, I think, in retrospective, I think this has brought us together, but we've always been close. This is just another excuse for us to talk more about things and get together. And we had more meetings gathering the information. I went ahead and wrote this book. I don't know if I asked for a manuscript. I don't know if I said, can I do this? Or would you all like to do it? I just did it. And that is just the way I am sometimes. It's like that Marine in me, just go without asking.
Right.
And that has always been an issue with me, but I think my sister said it was okay, but I can't remember. And I may have pissed them off. I don't know.
And we thought it was okay.
Okay. I'm going to interject here because she did tell us, and we've talked about this before. As a matter of fact, she asked us, and she asked me if I wanted to help her. And at the time, I was working 24/7. I was so busy, and I knew that I couldn't jump in full speed, but I said, I'll help you as much as I can. And the first thing I did was, I knew that I couldn't parse out time while I was here. So the first thing I did was take time off and go to Charlotte and meet with Heather and Amy. And that was the first meeting where we got all of the stuff together.
And then we went to Quantum.
Yeah. But then, but Amy started on this path, and she started drafting, and she would send copies of her drafts, and I'd look them over. And so we all knew that the story needed to come out. It needed to be told for us, for the Marine Corps, for, all those reasons that we've discussed before. And I think in a lot of ways, it's really brought us a lot closer. But like Amy said, we were close before, and we're all very different, and we appreciate our differences. And sometimes we laugh about them, and sometimes we're,
yeah.
But really, we get along well. And with, losing both of our parents, I think that breaks families apart, and it didn't break us, and it made us stronger. So this project definitely has brought us closer, but I would also say that it taught me more about myself and my relationship with my sisters, and what works, what doesn't work so well, what maybe we need to work on. But overall, it's a good thing. I think you might be asking for other people who might be interested in working with their family members on something like this. And I guess my only advice there is that I think it's good to know where everybody stands from the beginning, and really invite everyone to be a part of it, but know what that means, because you may want help, you may not want help, but feelings are important, and you want your relationships to continue and grow over the duration. You don't want hurt feelings. So that's a little tricky to navigate at times.
Now, we've shared a lot of stories about your grandfather, but do you guys individually have a favorite story that you want to just briefly go over and share individually what maybe your favorite story?
My favorite story is probably right before the Battle of Cape Gloucester. He started what is called the Improvisational Air Force. And he was realizing these big bombers that are coming in, dropping food for our Marines on the ground, the food, that are size of a half of a, twin bed or a queen bed, boom on the ground, are almost killing our Marines on the ground. So we need smaller planes to do our little deliveries and bring plasma or whatever it is. So he spied some planes that the Army was using, these little Piper Cubs, and he asked for permission from Vandergrift and whoever else to buy these planes from the Armies, these little Piper Clubs. And so he got these Piper Clubs, and he got his pilot, his aide, to basically put up some one ads throughout the Marine First Marine Division, and you got all sorts of people applying to be these aviators or to work on these planes. Mechanics, anybody, bush pilots, anybody that would be interested signed up to be part of this little mini Marine Corps Air Force, unofficial Air Force. And so he built all these Piper Clubs, this fleet, you don't call it fleet, but group of Piper Clubs to service the Marines on Cape Gloucester, which were really important once the battle started.
Oh,
So
that's
that-
cool.
Didn't he drop some critical supplies for Chesty Puller in one operation, or they did? Those planes.
So these little Piper Clubs were nonstop running, dropping food in smaller packages, plasma, anything they needed to the Marines, the boots on the ground. So it was, and Chesty as well. So it was really, really kind of a neat chapter.
Oh, very
And he
cool.
became very close to them. So
Very cool. Kim, Heather, do you guys have a favorite story?
I guess there's it's another story about a plane, but I have to tell you, like, with the research, I have these eureka moments where I'm like, oh my God, this is such a great story. And, there are all these little anecdotal kind of things that you read about in the paper or that you read in somebody's correspondence. And it's really fun. But I remember one that I haven't revisited in a while, but it had something to do with my grandfather rushing to the Piper Cub, and he had his it was like a dusk ride, and I guess he did some kind of reconnaissance, or he liked to check out surveil the situation as much as he could himself. So he was on a mission to do that, and his pilot was ready, and I guess he was kind of hurriedly shuffling out to the plane, and he seemed like a little ungainly, and the Theodore Petrus, I guess it was,
pilot
asked him what was going on, and it turned out that he had hand grenades, or he had these grenades in his pockets, and so so basically he was on his surveillance. He was dropping bombs out the little Piper Cub, and I think that's hysterical, on the enemy, of course.
Right.
So that's neat. So that's one of my stories.
That's fun.
I don't have any particular story. I just love seeing how his humor comes out, like in the thing Amy put up yesterday about the member of the Red Tape Society, the Order of the Red Tape Society, the Fastius Georgia Medal, where Army left us a hot potato and all, and he all the way down to his New Year's Eve card to the troops, and he would, on the letters that he would send Sleepy, he'd draw these little stick figures of the two of them.
Cartoons, yeah.
Yeah, it was funny. He had a lot of cartoons with, the old man says this, and that kind of thing. But his sense of humor, definitely.
Now, as we get close to wrapping this up, as you guys have gone through all this research and discovering and getting to know your grandfather a little bit more, what advice or insights do you guys have for grandfathers about either documentation, journals, or just relationships in general with grandkids and their families?
Talk your stories. I mean, I think it's so, we always talk, why didn't we ask our dad this stuff? Or we didn't have our grandfather alive to ask this, but we should have asked our dad. Talk to your parents about their parents, or talk to your grandfather or grandmother if your grandfather's not alive. Get the stories down. It's not, you want to get it down for you, but also for your family and for history, to contribute to the database of history. I think, what they have to tell, even though they may not think their story is important. It is important because it's a fabric of a community. It's the larger part of our whole system and stories and history.
Well, and it's like I queried my two elder children who are 27, 30, and my 30-year-old son finally got back to me. He basically said that obviously the family lineage had influence on me joining the military. Don't think I would have leaned that way so heavily if I hadn't grown up around that. Even though it skipped a generation, always being around military history at both parents' houses definitely piqued my interest at a young age. But I'd say Grandpa Dick, who was my husband's father, and our father, Pat, were more heavy influences for me at a young age, and really just the photo stories and physical reminders of military life. And of course, Aunt Jo talking about the golden age of the military, growing up around the officers' clubs and all that lifestyle. I didn't really get into Bill's stuff until college. I did a presentation about him in my naval science class, after which the Marine Master Sergeant said something to the tune of, "Damn boy, you should have been a Marine." But he likes the fact that we've done all the research because it's filling in the gaps for him of what he didn't know. Sure. So again, now we're talking his two grandfathers and then his great-grandfather, and how all three of them influenced him at different points in his life.
Right.
That influenced him mainly and he said that when he did that report for class, all he really had to go on was whatever they had at Arlington and something else. He really didn't have a lot to say. And he said, I wonder if the Marine Corps Museum now has the rifle crate up finally. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because a good friend of mine texted me an article yesterday, and she said, this makes me think about you and your grandfather. And it was a woman that was writing for a magazine or something was discussing in this article about, she was tasked with writing the obituary for her father. And she said, basically what was difficult and distressing about that wasn't, he lived a great life. He did all these wonderful things, but it wasn't so much that. What was really haunting was all the things that you wanted to ask them that you didn't get a chance to ask them, and about their life and about their relationships and things like that. And it really resonated with me, because it is true, whether it's for our father, our mother, or our grandfather or grandmother, once they're gone, those stories go with them. So like Amy said, like we've discussed before, if they may not think their story is important, but it is. And I, look forward to sitting down sometime soon with my husband's father and the family. We've collected a bunch of photographs. I'm in the process of scanning them all, and we're going to project them up on the big screen TV at his brother's house. And we're going to ask him about the pictures. This is a man who's in his late 80s now, and he was in the camps as a child, and he's losing his memory. So it's going to be fun to be able to go through that. And I'm going to set up a camera in the corner of the room and just let it run. Make sure it has plenty of film and just let it run, because, I think we got to get these stories down. They're so important, and somebody's going to want to know these things down the road, and maybe it'll ease their pain a little bit for having that loss, because they have those stories.
I think about when you're doing research and you're doing things like Ancestry.com. We have my mother's grandmother is married, and then 10 years later on the census, she's living with her mom and her 4-year-old daughter, who's our grandmother. And for the life of me, I couldn't find this guy. And his name is fairly normal, but I didn't know, I knew it wasn't him. So finally what I did, and this is where Ancestry is genius, is you can put a timeline up, right? So I looked between the two censuses and I'm like, oh, well, that's when World War I happened. Maybe he didn't come back home, because nobody could tell us what happened to him. Mm-hmm. My grandmother didn't know. And as silly as this sounds, I asked my Uncle Steve, who's the youngest of the 3 kids from our other side of the family, I'm like 2 years old, and my grandmother, who's probably my age, already has white hair. I'm like, do you remember when your mother got white hair? He's like, no, as far as I know, she's always had it, but she hadn't. So that's a stupid little thing. But if you have that kind of heredity genetically or whatever, you kind of like to know what that history is, you know? And so when you're doing research on your family and you're listening to your grandparents talking, you also want to take the medical history of the family that surrounds you, so you know what to look out for.
No, that's great information. As if anybody's interested in following the work and following the progression of the book, what's the best way for people to either get in contact or follow the progression?
Well, the update on the book is that I am working with a co-author who's a former Navy JAG officer. So he's also written a number of books, but he brings in kind of the amphibious element, the sea element that's very good. And we have a contract with a publisher, and we hope to get the book out in the fall. But with COVID, it's slower. Other than that, we have a Facebook page, a group page for the book, which has all sorts of people in there. Not a lot of people, because I haven't really promoted it that much. But it's a nice group because we share things, and there are all sorts of interested people and grandparents and people in there, and we share things. But that's Kimberly, did you change? It's discovering my grandfather, William H. Rupertus, right?
It's, whatever it is for Facebook, but the backslash is Major Gen Rupertus. So it's the abbreviation. I gave it to you.
Well, and I'm a member of the group. That's how I kind of found you.
Oh, good.
Stumbled in and found you guys.
Right.
So I'll make sure to put that into the show notes along with the other links that you guys have had, and I'll make sure to put the Rifleman's Creed in here too, since we referenced that so much. And like you said, it's in so many movies that I'm sure people would be interested to read it and not just.
Well, and eventually, I guess we'll have a website too that a lot of the information's on, and maybe we'll include something about how to research. Like when my mom was dying of ALS, we had a big website that talked about all the things that you can get that help you, and like that.
Well, it's late. We've gone way over our time, but this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. The history geek in me was absolutely loving the first part of this. So I appreciate your all's time, and would just like to say thank you so much for spending this time and talking about your grandfather and talking about grandfathers. Just have really enjoyed this conversation with you guys.
Well, thank you.
It's been great to talk to you too again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Wow, what a fun conversation this was. I was so lucky to have been able to meet these sisters and then learn about this project they have connecting with their grandfather. I hope that you really pulled out how much passion and how much they've grown to love and get close to their grandfather, whom they've never met, all through the documentation that they've been able to find, his letters, his journals, some of the public information that's out there, and just how connected they are to this great man. So what I'd love for you to do is, if you enjoyed this conversation, is please subscribe to the Cool Grandpa podcast, and then share this podcast with some friends that would enjoy hearing about grandfathers and the experiences that we have connecting with our grandfathers, as well as grandfathers that need and want to know that their relationship with their grandchildren, even if they never meet their grandchildren, is important. So please do me those things. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, and then share the podcast as well. That's the way we're going to help grow this grandfather-centered community and really spread the message about how important these relationships are between grandfathers and their grandchildren. I hope you guys are being awesome, and remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.granddaughters.com www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.